Sometimes the hardest inheritance to accept is the one that comes with a lifetime of unanswered questions. Jack Landon held the rusty cabin key, knowing it represented everything his estranged father had never explained before walking out of their lives 30 years ago. The neighbors in Pine Ridge whispered their judgments another, Landon chasing fool's gold, dragging his 8-year-old son into the family's legacy of disappointment. The cabin sat on 20 forgotten acres, its broken windows and sagging roof, a monument to decades of neglect. Jack's factory job was gone, the rent overdue, and Tommy deserved better than their cramped apartment where dreams went to die. But when Jack began clearing out the debris, he discovered his father had left more than just rotting wood and rusty nails. Hidden beneath the floorboards were journals, blueprints, and secrets that would change everything. The man who had abandoned them had spent 30 years building something extraordinary. But would Jack have the patience to uncover what his father had really left behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Landon's calloused fingers traced the edges of the faded family photograph one more time before tucking it back into his wallet. The image showed a younger version of himself, maybe 6 years old, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and oil-stained hands. His father, Thomas Landon, had been captured mid-laugh in that picture, his arm wrapped protectively around Jack's small shoulders. It was the only photograph Jack had kept from before the abandonment, the only proof that once upon a time they had been a family. The cramped one-bedroom apartment in Detroit felt even smaller this morning, with cardboard boxes stacked against every available wall and Tommy's excited chatter filling the stale air. His 8-year-old son bounced between the packed containers like a pinball, his sandy hair catching the weak sunlight that filtered through their single grimy window. "Dad, are we really going to live in a cabin like the ones in my adventure books?" Tommy asked. His green eyes, so much like his mother's, had been sparkling with anticipation that Jack wished he could share. "Something like that, buddy," Jack replied, forcing a smile as he sealed another box with packing tape that squealed in protest. The truth was, he had no idea what they were walking into. The lawyer's call 3 weeks ago had been brief and businesslike. His father was dead, had been for 2 months before anyone thought to track down his only living relative. Heart attack, they said. Alone in that cabin, probably for days before a postal worker noticed the accumulating mail. The inheritance consisted of 20 acres of Montana wilderness, a cabin that the lawyer diplomatically described as needing attention, and whatever personal effects remained inside. No money, no bank accounts, no life insurance policy, just land that probably wasn't worth the back taxes owed on it and a structure that might not even be habitable. But Jack's options had run out with his factory job 6 months ago. The automotive plant where he'd worked for 12 years had closed permanently, another casualty of overseas manufacturing and corporate restructuring. His unemployment benefits were exhausted. The landlord had already served 2 eviction notices, and Tommy's school had started asking pointed questions about missed supply fees and unpaid lunch accounts. The photograph in his wallet mocked him with its false promise of paternal love. Thomas Landon had walked out on a snowy February morning when Jack was 8, exactly Tommy's age, now leaving behind nothing but a note saying he had to take care of some business and would be back soon. Soon had stretched into weeks, then months, then years. Jack's mother had worked 3 jobs, trying to keep them afloat, her bitterness toward her absent husband growing like cancer until it consumed whatever warmth had once existed in their small house. She died when Jack was 17, worn down by exhaustion and disappointment. At the funeral, Jack had scanned the sparse crowd of mourners, half expecting to see his father's face among them. But Thomas Landon hadn't come home for his wife's burial, just as he hadn't come home for Jack's high school graduation, his wedding to Sarah, or Tommy's birth. "Why didn't Grandpa Thomas ever visit us?" Tommy asked suddenly, as if reading his father's thoughts. The boy had stopped bouncing and was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully wrapping his collection of superhero action figures in newspaper. Jack paused in his packing, choosing his words carefully. Tommy knew the basic facts that his grandfather had left before Jack grew up, that they'd never met, but Jack had tried to shield him from the anger and abandonment that had shaped so much of his own adult life. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that are hard to understand," Jack said finally. "Your grandfather was dealing with something that made him think he needed to stay away. I don't know what it was, but maybe we'll learn more about it when we get to the cabin." Tommy nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the resilience that children possessed in abundance. His son had already endured more upheaval than any child, should losing his mother to cancer when he was 5, watching his father struggle with grief and unemployment, adapting to a parade of temporary apartments as their financial situation deteriorated. Through it all, Tommy had remained optimistic, finding adventure in uncertainty and treating each setback as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent defeat. The drive to Montana would take them through 4 states and consume most of their remaining savings in gas and cheap motel rooms. Jack had calculated and recalculated the numbers, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. They'd arrive in Pine Ridge with less than $300 to their name and whatever canned goods he could fit in the back seat of their 12-year-old Honda. Pine Ridge, Montana. Population 847, according to the road atlas Jack had studied at the library. The town sat in the shadow of the Beartooth Mountains, surrounded by national forest and private ranches that had been in the same families for generations. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where newcomers were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of acceptance. The lawyer, a weary-sounding man named Herbert Paulson, had been blunt about the local sentiment regarding the Landon property. "Your father wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms when he showed up 30 years ago," Paulson had explained during their phone conversation. "Kept to himself mostly, which didn't help matters. Folks around here value community involvement, and Thomas never seemed interested in being neighborly. The cabin's been empty since he passed, and I'll be honest with you, some people think it's an eyesore that should be torn down." Jack had pressed for more details about his father's life in Pine Ridge, but Paulson's knowledge was limited to legal matters and second-hand gossip. Thomas had paid his property taxes on time, kept his affairs in order, and apparently lived simply enough that his estate consisted of little more than the land and whatever possessions remained in the cabin. "He did come into town regularly for supplies," Paulson had added. "Sarah Mackenzie at the general store might be able to tell you more. She's been there forever and has a memory like a steel trap. But I should warn you, don't expect a warm welcome. Your father's reputation wasn't exactly sterling around these parts." The photograph seemed to grow heavier in Jack's wallet as he contemplated their uncertain future. The man in that faded image bore no resemblance to the reclusive figure that Paulson had described. The Thomas Landon that Jack remembered, however, dimly had been animated and curious, always tinkering with some mechanical project in the garage or explaining how things worked with the patience of a natural teacher. But that had been 30 years ago, and people changed. Perhaps the man who had abandoned his family had found some measure of peace in the Montana wilderness. Perhaps the isolation had suited him better than the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. Jack tried not to let the familiar resentment rise in his chest, focusing instead on the practical matters at hand. Tommy had finished wrapping his action figures and moved on to his books, handling each one with the reverence that only true readers possessed. His son's love of stories had been one of the few bright spots during their darkest days, providing both escape and hope when reality became too overwhelming. Jack watched him carefully place a worn copy of Treasure Island into a box and felt a pang of guilt for uprooting him from the only home he'd ever known. "Dad, do you think there might be real treasure at the cabin?" Tommy asked, looking up from his packing with eyes full of possibility. Jack's throat tightened. His son's innocence and optimism were precious gifts that Jack was determined to protect, even as their circumstances grew more desperate. "I don't know about treasure, buddy, But maybe we'll find something valuable like a chance to start over and build something better together." Tommy grinned at this response, apparently satisfied with the idea that their adventure might yield riches beyond gold and jewels. Like in the stories where the real treasure is friendship and family. "Exactly like that," Jack said, meaning it more than he'd expected to. Whatever waited for them in Pine Ridge, whether disappointment or opportunity, they would face it together. And perhaps, in the process of sifting through his father's abandoned life, Jack might finally find the answers to questions that had haunted him for 3 decades. The apartment around them bore the hollow echoes of a life being dismantled. Furniture they couldn't afford to move sat abandoned, their surfaces marked with rings from countless meals and homework sessions. The walls displayed pale rectangles where pictures had hung, ghostly reminders of happier times when Sarah had been alive and their future had seemed secure and predictable. Jack sealed the last box and surveyed their meager possessions. Everything they owned now fit into a dozen cardboard containers and a handful of suitcases. It was a humbling inventory for a man of 38, a stark reminder of how quickly stability could evaporate and leave you grasping for anything solid enough to hold on to. But as he watched Tommy carefully arrange his treasured books in their designated box, Jack felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe poverty had stripped away their material security, but it hadn't touched the bond between father and son. Maybe losing everything they thought they needed would help them discover what they actually couldn't live without. The keys to their old life sat heavy in his palm as Jack prepared to hand them over to the landlord. Tomorrow they would load up the Honda and point it toward Montana, toward answers and uncertainty in equal measure. Toward a father's abandoned legacy and a son's boundless faith in happy endings. The faded photograph would travel with them, tucked safely in Jack's wallet knot, as a reminder of past betrayals, but as evidence that once upon a time love had existed between them. And if love had existed once, perhaps it could be found again, buried somewhere beneath the disappointment and years of silence. In the growing twilight of their last evening in Detroit, father and son sat together on the bare floor of their empty home, sharing a pizza that represented the last of their dining-out budget. Tommy chatted excitedly about their upcoming adventure, spinning elaborate theories about what they might discover at the mysterious cabin. Jack listened and nodded, allowing his son's enthusiasm to kindle a small flame of hope in his own guarded heart. Whatever Thomas Landon had left behind in that remote Montana cabin, it couldn't be worse than the dead-end life they were leaving behind. And maybe, just maybe, it would be better than either of them dared to imagine. The hand-drawn property map crinkled in Jack's weathered hands as he stood beside their loaded Honda, staring at what his father had called home for 30 years. The cabin squatted like a wounded animal in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated neglect and Montana winters. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, their frames warped and splitting. The front porch tilted at an alarming angle, its support posts rotted through at the base. Tommy pressed his face against the car window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied their new home with the analytical eye of an 8-year-old. "It looks like the haunted house from my Halloween books," he announced with the matter-of-fact tone that children used to deliver devastating observations. "It just needs some work," Jack said, though his heart sank as he took inventory of the visible damage. The property map in his hands showed precise measurements and boundary markers drawn in his father's careful handwriting. But it also contained mysterious notations and symbols that made no immediate sense. Small X marks dotted various locations around the property, accompanied by cryptic notes like "Foundation Check" and "Eastern Corner Remember Depth." A rusty pickup truck rumbled up the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over their already grimy Honda. 2 men climbed out, both wearing work clothes and expressions of barely concealed hostility. The older man, perhaps 60 with a grey beard and suspicious eyes, approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "You must be Thomas's boy," he said without extending his hand. "I'm Bill Morrison, live about 2 miles south. This here is Pete Carlson." He gestured to his companion, a younger man with calloused hands and the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. "We heard you might be coming to claim this place." Jack folded the property map and slipped it into his jacket pocket, suddenly protective of his father's handwritten notations. "That's right. I'm Jack Landon, and this is my son, Tommy." Morrison's gaze swept over the dilapidated cabin with evident distaste. "No offense, but this property's been an eyesore for years. Your father never bothered to maintain it properly, and now it's attracting raccoons and God knows what else. Some of us have been hoping whoever inherited it would just tear the whole thing down and sell the land to someone who'd use it properly." Tommy rolled down his window, apparently fascinated by the conversation. "Are you our new neighbors?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Pete Carlson softened slightly at the boy's question. "We live nearby, son. Just wanted to welcome you to Pine Ridge and maybe offer some advice about this place." "What kind of advice?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the direction this conversation was heading. Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence. "Look, I don't know what kind of stories your father might have told you about this property, but the truth is, it's not worth the taxes you'll pay on it. The cabin's uninhabitable, the well probably needs expensive repairs, and you're 20 miles from the nearest grocery store. Winter comes early up here and stays late. This isn't a place for a man with a young boy to try making a fresh start." Jack studied the two men's faces, reading the mixture of genuine concern and barely disguised hope that he would simply walk away. "I appreciate the warning," he said carefully, "but we're here to stay, at least for now." The property map felt warm against his chest, its mysterious markings suddenly more intriguing than discouraging. His father had lived here for 3 decades, surviving Montana winters and rural isolation. There had to be more to this place than the obvious decay and damage. Morrison shrugged, his expression suggesting he'd done his neighborly duty and washed his hands of whatever followed. "Well, if you change your mind, there are folks who'd be interested in buying the land. Good timber value, and the location's got potential for someone with the resources to develop it properly." After the men drove away, Jack and Tommy stood together in the settling dust, studying their inheritance with fresh eyes. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the property and highlighting details that hadn't been visible from the road. "Dad, look at that." Tommy pointed toward the side of the cabin, where Jack noticed something that made his pulse quicken. What he'd initially mistaken for random damage to the siding revealed itself as carefully concealed modifications. Several boards had been altered to create hidden panels, their edges so precisely cut that they were nearly invisible unless viewed from the correct angle. Jack pulled out the property map again, studying his father's notations with new understanding. The X marks weren't random. They corresponded to specific architectural features of the cabin and surrounding outbuildings. His father hadn't just lived here. He'd systematically modified and expanded the property in ways that weren't immediately apparent to casual observers. "This is like a puzzle, isn't it?" Tommy said, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "Grandpa Thomas made everything secret and hidden, just like in my adventure books." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jack felt his own curiosity beginning to override his initial disappointment. He approached the front door, noting that while the porch was indeed unstable, the door itself appeared solid and well-maintained. The lock was new, installed recently enough that the metal still gleamed beneath a light coating of dust. The key turned smoothly, and the door swung open to reveal an interior that defied every expectation set by the cabin's exterior appearance. While the outside suggested decades of neglect, the inside told a completely different story. The main room was clean and organized, furnished with handmade furniture that showed both skill and care in its construction. Books lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines covering subjects ranging from engineering and physics to philosophy and literature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean and ready for use. "Whoa," Tommy whispered, his voice echoing in the unexpectedly spacious interior. "It's like a secret hideout inside a broken house." Jack moved deeper into the cabin, his understanding of his father's situation shifting with each new detail. This wasn't the home of a broken man living in squalor. It was the carefully maintained sanctuary of someone who valued privacy and intellectual pursuits over appearances and social approval. A large oak desk sat beneath the cabin's main window, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers and what appeared to be technical drawings. Jack approached cautiously, feeling like an intruder in his father's private space, despite his legal right to be there. The property map in his pocket seemed to pulse with new significance as he studied the room's layout. His father had been far more than the eccentric hermit that the neighbors described. The evidence of his intelligence and careful planning was everywhere in the quality of the furniture, the organization of the books, the precision of the architectural modifications that had transformed a simple cabin into something approaching a sophisticated retreat. Tommy discovered a narrow staircase leading to what appeared to be a loft area, but Jack caught his arm before he could climb up. "Let's explore together, buddy. We don't know what condition everything is in yet." But even as he spoke the words, Jack realized they weren't true. The cabin's interior was in excellent condition, maintained with the care of someone who intended to live there for many years to come. His father hadn't abandoned this place, he'd perfected it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Landon hadn't been running away from his responsibilities when he came to Montana. He'd been building something, creating something, preparing something. The question that burned in Jack's mind as he stood in his father's carefully crafted sanctuary was simple and terrifying. Preparing for what? The property map crinkled again as Jack unfolded it, studying the mysterious notations with new urgency. Whatever his father had been doing here for 30 years, it was far more complex and purposeful than anyone in Pine Ridge understood. And now, whether he was ready or not, it was Jack's responsibility to figure out what Thomas Landon had really left behind. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered and mysteries that had been 30 years in the making. The neighbors' mockery and warnings suddenly seemed less important than the evidence of his father's hidden intelligence spread out before them. "Dad," Tommy said softly, his young voice filled with wonder as he took in the room's unexpected sophistication. "I think Grandpa Thomas was a lot smarter than those men thought he was." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I think you're right, buddy. I think we're going to learn a lot about your grandfather that nobody else knows." The property map felt like a treasure map now, its cryptic markings promising revelations that would challenge everything Jack thought he knew about the man who had walked out of his life so many years ago. Whatever Thomas Landon had been building in this remote Montana cabin, it was theirs to discover now. The leather-bound journal felt substantial in Jack's hands, its pages yellowed with age but still crisp to the touch. He discovered it tucked behind a row of engineering textbooks on his father's desk, almost as if Thomas had positioned it where only someone who truly looked would find it. The first entry was dated 30 years ago, just months after his father had disappeared from their Detroit home. March 15th. The foundation work is nearly complete. The eastern quadrant required deeper excavation than anticipated, but the soil composition is ideal for long-term stability. If my calculations are correct, this site will support structures far beyond what the casual observer might imagine. Tommy perched on a handmade wooden stool beside his father, watching with fascination as Jack turned the journal's pages. The boy had adapted to their new environment with the resilience that seemed to be his superpower, treating the cabin's mysteries as an elaborate treasure hunt rather than a source of anxiety. "What does that mean, Dad? Foundation work?" Jack paused in his reading, trying to interpret his father's technical language. "I think it means your grandfather was planning to build something here. Something that needed a really strong foundation to support it." The journal's early entries revealed a Thomas Landon that Jack had never known, methodical, intelligent, and driven by some larger purpose that remained frustratingly unclear. Each page contained detailed observations about soil composition, weather patterns, and structural calculations that suggested his father possessed far more engineering knowledge than Jack remembered. April 20, the locals remain suspicious but manageable. Sarah Mackenzie at the general store seems willing to engage in civil conversation, though she clearly reports my activities to the broader community. This isolation suits my purposes perfectly. The work requires privacy and extended periods of uninterrupted focus. Jack felt a strange mix of pride and resentment as he read his father's words. The man who had abandoned his family apparently possessed the discipline and intelligence to undertake complex long-term projects. Why hadn't he shown that same commitment to his responsibilities as a husband and father? Tommy wandered away from the desk, drawn by his natural curiosity to explore the cabin's hidden corners. Jack watched him press his small hands against the wall panels they'd noticed earlier, searching for the concealed mechanisms that would reveal his grandfather's secrets. "Dad, I think this one moves," Tommy called from across the room. He discovered a section of wall paneling that seemed slightly different from the rest, its edges more precisely fitted than random construction would account for. Jack approached his son's discovery, bringing the journal with him. According to his father's property map, this wall corresponded to one of the mysterious X marks. He pressed gently against the panel, and it shifted inward with the smooth motion of well-maintained hardware. Behind the panel lay a shallow compartment containing more journals, technical drawings, and what appeared to be correspondence with various government agencies and private corporations. Jack selected another leather-bound volume at random, opening it to find entries that made his pulse quicken. June 18th, patent application submitted for improved solar cell efficiency design. Initial review suggests approval likely within 18 months. If successful, this single innovation could fund the larger project for decades. The foundation of tomorrow begins with the infrastructure we build today. Foundation of tomorrow, Tommy repeated, reading over his father's shoulder with the quick comprehension that had always impressed Jack. What kind of tomorrow was Grandpa Thomas building? The question hung in the air as Jack continued reading his father's journal entries. Each page revealed new layers of complexity, references to renewable energy patents, correspondence with universities about research collaboration, and detailed financial projections that suggested Thomas had been thinking in terms of decades rather than years. A knock at the cabin door interrupted their exploration. Jack glanced through the window to see a woman in her 60s standing on their unstable porch, holding what appeared to be a covered casserole dish. Her grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothing suggested someone comfortable with rural life, but not entirely rough around the edges. "Must be Sarah Mackenzie from the general store," Jack murmured, remembering the lawyer's suggestion that she might have known his father better than most locals. He opened the door carefully, mindful of the porch's questionable stability. The woman smiled warmly, her expression free of the suspicion that had marked his earlier encounters with the neighbors. "You must be Thomas's son," she said, extending the casserole dish. "I'm Sarah Mackenzie. I own the general store in town and wanted to welcome you properly to Pine Ridge. This is my grandmother's recipe for beef stew. Figured you might appreciate a home-cooked meal after your long drive." Jack accepted the dish gratefully, suddenly aware of how long it had been since they'd eaten anything more substantial than gas station sandwiches. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Mackenzie. I'm Jack, and this is my son, Tommy." Tommy appeared at his father's elbow, offering Sarah one of his most charming smiles. "Thank you for the stew. Dad's not a very good cook, so this is really nice." Sarah laughed, a sound that seemed to warm the afternoon air. "Well, I'm sure your father has many other talents to make up for it. May I come in for a moment? I'd like to talk with you about your father, if you're willing to listen." Jack hesitated, glancing back at the open journal on his father's desk. But something about Sarah's manner suggested genuine kindness rather than curiosity, and they could use an ally in Pine Ridge. "Of course. Please come in." Sarah entered the cabin and paused, her expression shifting to one of surprised recognition. "My goodness, He really did turn this place into something special, didn't he? You've been inside before? Only once, about 10 years ago, when I delivered some supplies during a particularly harsh winter. Thomas was concerned about running low on essentials, but he was too proud to come into town and admit he needed help. Sarah's eyes swept over the organized bookshelves and quality furniture. He showed me around a bit that day, and I could tell this place meant everything to him, but I never imagined he'd continued developing it to this extent. Jack found himself eager for any information about his father's life in Pine Ridge. What was he like? In town, I mean. The other neighbors we met didn't seem to think much of him. Sarah settled into one of Thomas's handmade chairs, accepting Tommy's offer of water from their travel supplies. Your father was a complicated man, Jack. He kept to himself mostly, but he wasn't unfriendly when you got him talking. The problem was that most folks around here didn't have the patience to get him talking. They saw a man who didn't attend church, didn't participate in community events, and didn't seem to need anyone's company. That makes people nervous in a small town. But you got to know him better. A little. He was one of my most reliable customers, always paid his bills promptly, and never caused any trouble. But more than that, he was clearly intelligent. The books he ordered, the magazines he subscribed to, the technical journals, this was not an ordinary hermit living off the grid. He was studying something, learning something, working toward something. I just never knew what. Tommy had returned to exploring the wall panels, and Jack heard him gasp with excitement from across the room. "Dad, look at this one." Another hidden compartment had revealed itself. This one containing what appeared to be architectural blueprints and engineering specifications. Jack excused himself from Sarah and joined his son, unfolding one of the technical drawings on his father's desk. The blueprint showed detailed plans for some kind of underground structure, far more complex than anything the cabin's exterior would suggest. The plans included specifications for ventilation systems, electrical infrastructure, and what appeared to be laboratory facilities. Sarah approached the desk, her expression growing more intrigued by the moment. "I remember now," she said slowly. "About 15 years ago, Thomas ordered some very expensive construction materials through the store. Concrete reinforcement, specialized electrical components, things that seemed far beyond what anyone would need for basic cabin maintenance. When I asked him about it, he just smiled and said he was working on his foundation for tomorrow." The phrase from the journal echoed in Jack's mind as he studied the blueprints. His father hadn't just been living in isolation, he'd been building something beneath the cabin, something that required the kind of engineering expertise that Thomas had apparently possessed all along. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Jack said carefully, "did my father ever mention why he left Detroit, why he came here in the first place?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Only once, and not directly. He'd had a few beers that evening, one of the rare times I ever saw him drink, and he said something about making sure his work would outlast his mistakes. He said he'd left behind people he loved because staying would have put them in danger, but someday they'd understand that everything he built was for them." Jack felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The journal entries suddenly took on new meaning, and the architectural plans spread across the desk represented something far more personal than he'd initially understood. His father hadn't abandoned them out of selfishness or inability to handle responsibility. He'd been working toward something, building something, creating something that he intended as a legacy for the family he'd left behind. The question that remained was what exactly Thomas Landon had been building in the Montana wilderness, and whether Jack and Tommy were ready to discover the full scope of his father's 30-year project. The blueprint portfolio lay spread across his father's workshop table like a roadmap to the impossible. Jack had discovered the basement workshop that morning, accessed through a concealed staircase hidden behind what appeared to be a simple storage closet. The space below ground was twice the size of the cabin above, carved from solid rock and reinforced with steel supports that spoke of serious engineering expertise. Tommy descended the workshop stairs with the careful steps of a boy who understood he was entering somewhere important. His eyes widened as he took in the sophisticated equipment that filled the underground space precision tools, electronic testing devices, and drafting tables covered with technical drawings that seemed decades ahead of their time. "Dad, this is like a secret laboratory," Tommy whispered, his voice filled with the same awe Jack was struggling to process. The blueprint portfolio contained dozens of technical drawings, each one more complex than the last. Jack recognized some as early computer component designs, others appeared to be renewable energy systems, and several showed innovations in manufacturing processes that he couldn't begin to understand. But what struck him most was the dates on the drawings. Many were created in the 1990s, years before similar technologies became commercially available. "Look at this one," Jack said, unfolding a blueprint that showed what appeared to be an advanced solar panel design. The technical specifications suggested efficiency rates far superior to anything he'd seen in mainstream renewable energy marketing. The date stamp showed it had been completed in 1994. Tommy leaned closer, tracing the intricate electrical diagrams with his finger. Grandpa Thomas was inventing things before other people even thought of them. Jack nodded, his understanding of his father's intelligence expanding with each new discovery. These weren't the hobby projects of an isolated hermit. They were the professional-grade innovations of a brilliant engineer who had somehow chosen to work in complete secrecy. A wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop drew Jack's attention. Its drawers were labeled with cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing to him initially, but as he began exploring their contents, patterns emerged. Patent applications contained copies of dozens of submissions to the U.S. Patent Office, many showing approval stamps and official documentation. Corporate correspondence held letters from major technology companies expressing interest in licensing various innovations. "Tommy, look at this," Jack said, holding up a letter dated just 5 years earlier. The letterhead belonged to a major electronics manufacturer, and the content made Jack's hands shake slightly as he read aloud. "Dear Mr. Landon, we are prepared to offer $2.3 million for exclusive licensing rights to your improved battery storage technology, as detailed in Patent 8-947-231. This represents a significant increase from our previous offer and reflects the growing market demand for your innovations." Tommy's eyes went wide. $2.3 million for one invention? Jack continued reading through the corporate correspondence, finding similar offers from different companies for various patents his father had developed. The numbers were staggering millions of dollars in licensing offers that his father had apparently either declined or ignored entirely. "Why didn't he take the money?" Tommy asked, voicing the question that Jack was struggling to answer. A leather journal tucked behind the patent files provided some insight. This volume contained entries from more recent years, showing Thomas's evolving perspective on his work and its purpose. December 8th declined another licensing offer from Reynolds Technologies. The battery storage patent alone could fund comfortable retirement, but that misses the larger point. These innovations aren't meant to enrich corporations that will limit their application for profit margins. The foundation of tomorrow requires different thinking. Jack paused in his reading, beginning to understand his father's long-term strategy. Thomas hadn't been hoarding his inventions out of eccentricity. He'd been waiting for the right opportunity to release them in a way that would maximize their benefit to society rather than corporate profits. January 15th, Jack would be 37 now. Tommy must be walking, probably talking. Sarah mentions she reads to him every night. I wonder if he likes adventure stories the way Jack did at that age. Every patent I file, every innovation I perfect, is another brick in the foundation I'm building for their future. They may never understand why I had to leave, but someday they'll benefit from what I've accomplished here. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. His father had been thinking about them, planning for them, building something intended to secure their future. The man he'd resented for 30 years had spent those same decades working toward their benefit. Tommy had discovered another section of the workshop where finished prototypes sat on carefully organized shelves. Solar panels that seemed far more sophisticated than anything commercially available, battery systems with compact designs that defied Jack's understanding of current technology, and electronic components that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. "These are the things from the drawings," Tommy said, carefully examining a prototype battery that was no larger than a paperback book, but apparently capable of storing enormous amounts of energy according to its attached specifications. Jack joined his son at the prototype shelves, handling his father's innovations with the reverence they deserved. Each device represented years of research and development, created in isolation but designed with global impact in mind. The financial value of the patents was impressive, but the potential social value of the technologies was staggering. A memory surfaced suddenly: his father, in their old Detroit garage, working on what Jack had assumed were pointless tinkering projects. Thomas had tried to explain his work to 8-year-old Jack, describing how small improvements in energy efficiency could eventually transform entire industries. But Jack had been more interested in playing with friends than listening to technical explanations, and his mother had discouraged what she saw as Thomas's unrealistic dreams. "He was always working on stuff like this," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "Even when I was your age, he was trying to invent things that would help people. I just never understood what he was doing." Tommy looked up from the prototype he was examining, his expression serious beyond his years. Maybe he had to leave so he could finish the work without people bothering him about it. "Like when I have to go to my room to concentrate on my hardest homework." The simple wisdom of his son's observation struck Jack profoundly. Perhaps Thomas's abandonment hadn't been about running away from responsibility. Perhaps it had been about accepting a different kind of responsibility, one that required sacrifice and isolation but promised benefits that extended far beyond their immediate family. The blueprint portfolio seemed to pulse with new significance as Jack considered the full scope of his father's work. These weren't just inventions, they were the foundation for technologies that could revolutionize renewable energy, improve manufacturing efficiency, and advance computing capabilities in ways that major corporations were apparently eager to exploit. But Thomas had chosen a different path. Rather than selling his innovations to the highest bidder, he'd spent 30 years perfecting them, testing them, and preparing them for release in a way that would maximize their benefit to humanity rather than corporate profit margins. "Dad," Tommy said softly, still studying the prototype battery in his hands, "I think Grandpa Thomas was trying to save the world, one invention at a time." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I think you're right, buddy, and I think he was trying to make sure we'd be part of that when the time came." The workshop around them represented more than just one man's life. Work-It was a treasure trove of innovations that could transform entire industries, created by a father who had sacrificed everything to ensure his family would inherit not just wealth, but the means to make a meaningful difference in the world. The question that remained was whether Jack was prepared to step into the role his father had spent 30 years preparing for him, and whether he could find the courage to continue Thomas's work, despite never having understood it while the man was alive to explain it. The patent documents collection occupied an entire filing cabinet in the Pine Ridge Library basement, where Jack had convinced the librarian to let him use their research facilities after explaining his situation. Spread across 3 tables were photocopies of official patent filings that revealed the true scope of his father's genius and the staggering financial empire he had quietly built over 3 decades of innovative work. Tommy sat cross-legged on the library floor, carefully organizing patent documents by date, while Jack worked through the more complex financial implications. What had begun as curiosity about his father's inventions had evolved into something approaching awe as the numbers became clear. "Dad, this one is for something called Advanced Photovoltaic Cell Architecture." Tommy read from a patent dated 1996. "It says here that 3 different companies wanted to license it, and the biggest offer was for $4 million. Jack looked up from his own stack of documents, where he'd been calculating the cumulative value of his father's patent portfolio. The preliminary numbers were staggering conservative estimates, suggested Thomas had turned down licensing offers totaling more than $50 million over the past 15 years. But look at this, Jack said, showing Tommy a more recent patent filing. He didn't just turn down the offers. He kept improving the designs, making them more efficient, more practical. This solar cell patent from last year shows efficiency rates 30% better than anything currently on the market. The librarian, a patient woman named Dorothy Chen, who had been surprisingly helpful despite the unusual nature of their research, approached their table with another box of materials. "I found these in our local business records," she said, setting down a collection of incorporation documents and business licenses. "It appears your father established several small corporations over the years, mostly for managing patent applications and licensing negotiations." Jack opened the business records, finding yet another layer of his father's careful planning. Thomas hadn't just been inventing in isolation, he'd been building a sophisticated legal and financial structure to manage his innovations. Each corporation had been established for specific purposes: renewable energy patents, computer technology innovations, manufacturing process improvements. "Mrs. Chen," Jack said, looking up from the incorporation papers, "do you know if my father worked with any local lawyers or accountants? This level of business organization would require professional help." Dorothy smiled knowingly. "Herbert Paulson, the lawyer, who contacted you about the inheritance, has been handling your father's legal affairs for over 20 years. He's been very discreet about it, but Thomas was one of his most important clients. You should probably schedule a meeting with him." The suggestion made perfect sense, but Jack felt a surge of frustration at the lawyer's earlier discretion. Paulson had made it sound like Thomas had died with minimal assets, when in reality he'd been managing a complex portfolio of valuable intellectual property. Tommy had moved on to a different section of patent documents, his young mind apparently better equipped than Jack's to navigate the technical specifications. "Dad, this one is really cool. It's called Integrated Energy Storage and Distribution System, and it looks like it could power a whole house with just one small battery." Jack joined his son, studying the patent drawings with growing amazement. The energy storage system represented a quantum leap beyond current battery technology, combining several of Thomas's other innovations into a unified solution that could revolutionize home energy management. "According to this," Jack said, reading the technical specifications, "a single unit could store enough energy to power an average home for 2 weeks. And it could be recharged from solar panels, wind generators, or conventional electrical grid connections." The patent was dated just 2 years ago, suggesting Thomas had continued innovating right up until his death. But more importantly, it had never been licensed to any corporation. It remained entirely under Thomas's control, which meant it now belonged to Jack and Tommy. "How much do you think something like this would be worth?" Tommy asked, his 8-year-old mind grappling with concepts that challenged even Jack's understanding. Before Jack could answer, Dorothy returned with yet another box of materials. "I almost forgot about these," she said, setting down what appeared to be correspondence files. "Your father maintained a post office box in town for business correspondence. The postmaster asked me to give these to you when you came in." The correspondence files contained letters from major corporations, government agencies, and international technology firms, all expressing interest in licensing or purchasing various patents that Thomas controlled. The dates ranged from recent months back to the early 1990s, showing 3 decades of persistent corporate interest in his work. One letter particularly caught Jack's attention. It was from the Department of Energy, dated just 6 months before Thomas's death, and it expressed serious interest in his energy storage technologies for national grid stabilization projects. "Dear Mr. Landon," Jack read aloud, "our technical review board has determined that your integrated energy storage system represents a significant advancement in grid-scale energy management. We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss potential government partnership opportunities for large-scale implementation of your technologies." Tommy looked up from his own reading with excitement. The government wanted to use Grandpa's inventions, like for the whole country. Jack nodded, his understanding of his father's work expanding once again. Thomas hadn't just been creating products for commercial sale, he'd been developing technologies that could transform energy infrastructure on a national scale. The implications were staggering, both in terms of social impact and financial value. A calculation was forming in Jack's mind as he worked through the patent values and corporate interest letters. Conservative estimates suggested his father's patent portfolio was worth tens of millions of dollars in immediate licensing potential. But if the technologies were as revolutionary as they appeared, their long-term value could be far greater. "Dad, look at this one," Tommy said, holding up a letter from a European renewable energy consortium. They wanted to pay $25 million just for the rights to use Grandpa's solar panel designs in Europe. Jack took the letter, noting that it was dated just 8 months ago, after Thomas should have been able to respond if he'd wanted to pursue the opportunity. Yet there was no indication in the correspondence files that he'd replied to any of the recent offers. The pattern was becoming clear. Thomas had spent 30 years perfecting his innovations, building a comprehensive portfolio of technologies that could revolutionize multiple industries. But rather than cashing in on their immediate commercial value, he'd been waiting for something, preparing for some larger purpose that required keeping the technologies under his direct control. A memory surfaced of his father's journal entry about building the foundation of tomorrow. Perhaps Thomas had never intended to sell his innovations piecemeal to corporations that would exploit them for short-term profits. Perhaps he'd been planning something far more ambitious, a comprehensive release of technologies that could benefit humanity as a whole, rather than enriching individual companies. "Tommy," Jack said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and overwhelming responsibility, "I think your grandfather was planning to change the world. And I think he was planning for us to help him do it." The patent documents spread across the library tables represented more than just financial inheritance. They were the blueprint for a technological revolution that one brilliant man had spent his entire adult life preparing. The question that now faced Jack was whether he had the courage and wisdom to continue his father's work, despite having spent 30 years misunderstanding the man's true purpose. Outside the library windows, the Montana afternoon was fading into evening, but inside, father and son continued their exploration of Thomas Landon's extraordinary legacy, each new discovery adding another piece to a puzzle that was far more complex and valuable than either of them had imagined possible. The safe deposit box key was impossibly small, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Walden that had been sitting innocuously among the hundreds of other books on his father's shelves. Jack might never have found it if Tommy hadn't been drawn to Thoreau's classic, recognizing it as one of the books his mother used to read to him before bedtime. "Dad, this book feels weird," Tommy had said, shaking the volume gently. The faint rattle of metal against paper had led to the discovery of the key, along with a small note in Thomas's careful handwriting. "First National Bank of Billings, Box 847. The real foundation requires solid ground to build upon." Now, 3 hours later, Jack and Tommy sat in the sterile fluorescent lighting of the bank's safety deposit box room, staring at contents that redefined everything they thought they understood about Thomas Landon's 30-year project. The box contained investment account statements, trust fund documents, and financial records that painted a picture of careful wealth accumulation spanning 3 decades. But these weren't the chaotic finances of an eccentric inventor. They were the methodical investments of a brilliant man who understood both technology and markets well enough to turn innovation into extraordinary prosperity. "Dad, what does this number mean?" Tommy asked, pointing to the bottom line of the most recent investment summary. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he read the figure aloud. $198,437,000. The words hung in the air between them like something from a fantasy story. Jack read the number again, checking and rechecking the decimal points, convinced he must be misinterpreting the financial documents somehow. But every account statement, every investment summary, every trust fund balance confirmed the impossible reality. His father, the man who had walked out on his family and lived like a hermit in a remote Montana cabin, had accumulated a fortune approaching $200 million. How? Jack whispered, more to himself than to Tommy. How did he do this? The answer lay in the other documents contained in the safety deposit box. Patent royalty statements showed that while Thomas had refused to sell his innovations outright, he had carefully licensed specific applications to selected companies, retaining control over the core technologies while generating steady income streams. But the real genius was in his investment strategy. Thomas had used his patent royalties to fund early investments in technology companies that would later become industry giants. The documents showed he'd purchased significant stakes in renewable energy startups, computer technology firms, and manufacturing companies that aligned with his own innovations, often years before they became profitable or widely recognized. "Look at this," Jack said, unfolding an investment statement from 1995. He bought 10,000 shares of something called Solar Tech Solutions for $3 per share. According to this recent statement, those same shares are now worth over $400 each. Tommy did the math with the quick mental arithmetic that had always impressed Jack. That's like turning $30,000 into $4 million? Exactly. And he did this dozens of times with dozens of different companies. Jack spread out more investment documents, revealing a portfolio that read like a prediction of the technology industry's evolution over the past 3 decades. Thomas had invested early in companies that developed internet infrastructure, renewable energy systems, advanced manufacturing processes, and breakthrough medical technologies. In every case, his investment timing had been extraordinarily prescient, as if he'd possessed insider knowledge about which technologies would eventually transform their respective industries. But as Jack studied the investment patterns more carefully, he realized it wasn't insider knowledge, it was superior technical understanding. Thomas had recognized the potential of emerging technologies because he was working on similar innovations himself. His patent portfolio had given him insights into industry trends that most investors couldn't possibly possess. He was playing a completely different game, Jack said, his admiration for his father's strategic thinking growing with each new revelation. While other people were guessing about which companies might succeed, he actually understood the technology well enough to make informed predictions. Tommy had discovered another section of the safety deposit box containing what appeared to be legal documents. "Dad, what's a trust fund?" Jack took the trust documents, scanning through legal language that gradually became clear despite its complexity. Thomas had established multiple trust funds, all designed to provide long-term financial security for Jack and Tommy while preserving the capital for future generations. "It means your grandfather set up special accounts that will take care of us forever," Jack explained, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "The money grows over time, but we can use some of it for important things like education, housing, and helping other people." But the most surprising discovery was yet to come. At the bottom of the safety deposit box lay a sealed envelope addressed simply to Jack and Tommy. Inside, Thomas's final financial instructions revealed the true scope of his long-term planning. "My dear son and grandson," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I have passed away and you have taken the time to truly explore what I built during our years apart. The financial resources you have discovered are not meant to be hoarded or spent frivolously. They represent the foundation for something far more important than personal wealth." Jack paused in his reading, glancing at Tommy, whose young face showed the serious concentration he reserved for truly important conversations. "The patents, investments, and accumulated capital are intended to fund the Landon Foundation organization, dedicated to releasing beneficial technologies freely to humanity, rather than selling them to the highest corporate bidder. Every innovation I developed, Every dollar I invested, every sacrifice I made was toward this single purpose, ensuring that technological advancement serves human flourishing rather than corporate profit. The weight of his father's vision settled over Jack like a mantle of responsibility he'd never asked for but couldn't ignore. Thomas hadn't just been accumulating wealth, he'd been building the financial infrastructure necessary to revolutionize how beneficial technologies were developed and distributed. "You now have the resources to continue this work," the letter continued. "The choice is yours whether to honor the vision or simply enjoy the financial security. But I hope you will consider that the true treasure is not the money itself, but the opportunity to use it in service of something larger than ourselves." Tommy leaned against his father's shoulder, apparently sensing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "Grandpa Thomas wanted us to help people with his inventions, didn't he?" Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotions that ranged from gratitude to overwhelming responsibility to deep regret for the 30 years of misunderstanding that had separated him from his father's true purpose. "He did, buddy. He spent his whole life building something that could make the world better, and now he wants us to help him finish it." The bank vault around them felt simultaneously like a treasure chamber and a sacred space, holding not just extraordinary wealth, but the carefully preserved dream of a man who had sacrificed everything, including his family's understanding, to serve a vision larger than personal happiness. Outside the vault, the afternoon sun was setting over Montana's vast landscape, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward a future that Thomas Landon had spent 30 years preparing his son and grandson to inherit. The question that remained was whether Jack had the courage and wisdom to step into the role his father had envisioned for him, despite having spent most of his adult life resenting the man who had made it all possible. The final letter from his father waited in a sealed envelope, tucked behind the last page of the trust fund documents, its paper yellowed with age and marked with a date from just 3 months before Thomas's death. Jack's hands shook as he broke the wax seal, knowing instinctively that whatever lay inside would complete the picture his father had spent 30 years creating. Tommy sat quietly beside him in the bank's privacy room, somehow understanding that this moment required reverence rather than his usual energetic curiosity. The afternoon light streaming through the small window cast everything in golden hues that seemed to sanctify the moment of final revelation. "My dearest Jack," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have discovered not just the financial resources I accumulated, but also the deeper purpose behind my apparent abandonment of our family. I know that no explanation can fully heal the wounds my departure created, but I hope that understanding my reasons might begin that healing process." Jack paused, his vision blurring slightly as 30 years of resentment collided with the possibility of understanding. Beside him, Tommy waited patiently, his small hand resting supportively on his father's arm. "The truth is that I never wanted to leave you and your mother. Every day of our separation has been a form of torture that I accepted only because staying would have put you both in mortal danger. The work I was doing in Detroit, the early patents, the prototype development had, attracted the attention of certain corporations that were willing to use violence to control technologies they considered valuable." Jack felt his world shifting as he processed his father's words. The abandonment he'd interpreted as selfish disregard had actually been protective sacrifice. 3 different attempts were made to break into our home and steal my research. The final incident involved men who made it clear that your mother and you would be harmed if I didn't surrender my work to their corporate sponsors. That night, I realized that the only way to keep you safe was to disappear entirely, taking my research with me and leaving no trail that could lead them back to you. The letter trembled in Jack's hands as decades of bitter assumptions crumbled and reformed into something approaching understanding. His father hadn't run away from responsibility. He'd accepted a crushing burden of isolation to protect the family he loved. "I came to Montana with nothing but my notebooks and the desperate hope that I could continue my work in isolation while keeping you and your mother safe from the corporate interests that wanted to exploit my innovations." Every patent I filed, every investment I made, every technological breakthrough I achieved was motivated by a single purpose, building a legacy that would someday provide for you and any family you might create. Tommy shifted closer to his father, apparently sensing the emotional weight of the revelations, even if he couldn't fully understand their implications. "Dad, are you okay?" Jack nodded, though tears were streaming down his face as he continued reading his father's explanation of 30 years of sacrifice and planning. "I know that my absence caused you pain, and I know that your mother suffered because of my decision to protect you through separation, rather than staying to face the danger together. I have lived with that guilt every day, but I have also lived with the certainty that staying would have resulted in your deaths along with mine." The corporate danger that had driven Thomas into exile suddenly made sense of other mysteries Jack had discovered. The sophisticated security systems in the cabin, the hidden workshops, the careful legal structures protecting his patents, all of it represented the precautions of a man who knew he was still being hunted. "The technologies I developed over these 30 years are worth far more than the financial statements suggest. In the wrong hands, they could be used to consolidate corporate power and increase inequality. In the right hands, your hands, they could democratize energy access, improve manufacturing efficiency, and advance human flourishing on a global scale." Jack paused in his reading, overwhelmed by the scope of responsibility his father was placing on his shoulders. The 198 million fortune was staggering enough, but the expectation that he would become a steward of world-changing technologies felt almost impossibly daunting. "I chose to live as a hermit, not because I preferred isolation, but because the work required absolute secrecy and security. Every day I spent away from you was a day spent preparing for the moment when you would inherit not just financial resources, but the power to transform how technology serves humanity." Tommy had been listening intently to his father's quiet reading, and now he spoke with the wisdom that seemed to emerge from him during their most important conversations. Grandpa Thomas was like a superhero who had to hide his secret identity to protect the people he loved. The analogy was surprisingly apt, and it helped Jack process the magnitude of his father's sacrifice. Thomas Landon had indeed lived a kind of double life, maintaining the appearance of an eccentric hermit, while actually serving as a guardian of technologies that could benefit millions of people. "The corporate interests that drove me into exile still exist, and they will eventually discover what I built here. When that happens, you will face the same choice I faced. Surrender these technologies to be exploited for private profit, or find a way to protect them while using them for the greater good." A chill ran down Jack's spine as he realized that his father's isolation might not have provided permanent protection after all. If corporate entities were still searching for Thomas's innovations, his death might actually increase the danger rather than ending it. "I have spent 30 years preparing you for this responsibility, even though you didn't know it was coming. The financial resources will provide security and independence. The patent portfolio will give you legal control over revolutionary technologies. The foundation documents will provide a structure for releasing these innovations in ways that serve humanity rather than corporate shareholders." Jack looked up from the letter to meet Tommy's serious gaze. His 8-year-old son somehow seemed to understand that they were discussing more than just money and inventions. They were confronting a legacy that would define the rest of their lives. "But most importantly," the letter continued, "you now have the opportunity to heal the wound that my departure created in our family. I could not be the father you needed during your childhood, but perhaps I can still provide the foundation for the man you've become and the father you are to Tommy." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, finally articulating the forgiveness he hadn't known he needed. His father's absence had indeed wounded him, but it had also shaped him into someone capable of understanding sacrifice and long-term thinking. "The choice is entirely yours, my son. You can sell everything, take the money, and live comfortably without ever engaging with the larger purpose I envisioned. Or you can step into the role I spent 30 years preparing for you as a guardian of technologies that could help heal the world's problems while providing security for your own family. Jack folded the letter carefully, his mind reeling with the implications of everything he'd learned. His father hadn't abandoned them out of weakness or selfishness. He'd made the most difficult choice possible, sacrificing his own happiness to protect them while building something extraordinary for their future. "Tommy," Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I think I finally understand why your grandfather had to leave us, and I think I understand what he wants us to do with what he left behind." The boy nodded gravely, his young mind apparently grasping the essential truth, even if the details remained complex. "He wants us to use his inventions to help people, doesn't he? Like superheroes with science instead of superpowers." Jack smiled through his tears, amazed once again by his son's ability to distill complex situations into their essential elements. "Exactly like that, buddy. Exactly like that." The bank vault around them no longer felt like a treasure chamber, it felt like a sacred trust, holding not just extraordinary wealth but the carefully preserved love of a father who had sacrificed everything to ensure his family's future while serving something larger than himself. The real treasure wasn't the money or even the patents, it was the opportunity for redemption, understanding, and the chance to honor a love that had never wavered despite 30 years of necessary separation. The grandfather's watch felt heavy in Jack's palm as he sat in the restored cabin 3 weeks after discovering his father's final letter. The vintage timepiece had been Thomas's father's, passed down through generations of Landon men who had apparently shared a tradition of quiet determination and long-term thinking. Now it belonged to Jack, its steady tick marking moments that felt pregnant with possibility and responsibility. Tommy was curled up in one of his grandfather's handmade chairs, reading through simplified versions of the patent documents that Jack had prepared for him. At 8 years old, his son couldn't grasp all the technical complexities, but he understood the essential point. They now controlled technologies that could change the world, and they had to decide how to use them responsibly. "Dad, the solar panel invention could power whole cities without pollution, right?" Tommy asked, looking up from his reading with the serious expression he wore when processing important information. "That's right, buddy. And the battery storage system could help save energy from sunny days to use on cloudy ones, or from windy days to use when the air is still." Jack had been learning the technical details himself, working through his father's journal entries and patent specifications with the help of engineering textbooks from the local library. The phone rang, interrupting their quiet planning session. Jack had installed a landline in the cabin, partly for practical communication, and partly because cell service remained spotty in their remote location. The caller was Herbert Paulson, the lawyer who had handled Thomas's affairs and was now helping Jack navigate the complex legal implications of his inheritance. "Jack, we need to talk." Paulson's voice carried an urgency that made Jack's stomach tighten. "I've been contacted by representatives from 3 different corporations, all expressing interest in acquiring your father's patent portfolio. They're offering extraordinary sums. We're talking about immediate payments that could exceed the value of your current investments." Jack felt a familiar chill as he remembered his father's warnings about corporate interests that had driven him into exile. "What kind of corporations?" "Major players in renewable energy, computer technology, and manufacturing. They're being very aggressive about their interest, and they've made it clear that they consider your father's patents to be extremely valuable to their long-term strategic planning." The timing felt ominous. Jack had spent the past 3 weeks quietly researching his options, consulting with financial advisors, and beginning to establish the legal framework for the Landon Foundation that his father had envisioned. He'd been careful to avoid publicity or any actions that might attract unwanted attention to their situation. "How did they find out about the patents so quickly?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Patent filings are public record once they're approved, but these corporations seem to have more detailed information than what's publicly available. They know about patents that were filed under various corporate names your father established, and they have detailed knowledge of the technologies involved. Someone has been doing very thorough research." Jack glanced at Tommy, who had stopped reading and was listening to the phone conversation with the alertness that children developed when they sensed adult concern. His son's presence reminded him that this wasn't just about Jack's own decisions. Whatever he chose would affect Tommy's future and safety. "What are you recommending?" Jack asked. "Honestly, I'm recommending that you consider their offers very seriously. The money they're proposing would set you and Tommy up for life, and it would eliminate any potential complications from trying to manage the technologies yourself. Your father was brilliant, but he was also paranoid about corporate threats that may not be as serious as he believed." But Jack had read his father's journals carefully, and the corporate surveillance and intimidation that Thomas described didn't sound like paranoia. Sounded like documented experience with dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to control valuable technologies. After ending the call with Paulson, Jack sat quietly with Tommy, both of them processing the implications of the corporate interest. The offers were tempting immediate financial security without the overwhelming responsibility of managing world-changing technologies. But they would also mean abandoning his father's 30-year vision of democratizing beneficial innovations instead of letting them be exploited for corporate profit. "Dad, what do you think Grandpa Thomas would want us to do?" Tommy asked, his young voice cutting straight to the heart of Jack's internal struggle. Jack looked down at his father's watch, its hands marking the passage of time that felt simultaneously urgent and eternal. "I think he would want us to be brave enough to do what's right, even if it's harder than what's easy." Tommy nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Like in my adventure books, where the heroes have to choose between keeping treasure for themselves or using it to help everyone." The analogy was surprisingly accurate. Jack and Tommy now possessed technological treasures that could benefit millions of people, but only if they had the courage to resist the corporate interests that wanted to control and limit their application. Over the following days, Jack threw himself into understanding both the technical potential of his father's innovations and the practical challenges of implementing them responsibly. He studied renewable energy markets, researched patent law, and consulted with experts who could help him evaluate his options. The more he learned, the more he understood why his father had been so determined to maintain control over his inventions. The solar panel and battery storage technologies alone could revolutionize energy access in developing countries, but only if they were priced affordably and shared openly, rather than being controlled by corporations focused on maximizing profit margins in wealthy markets. Tommy helped in his own way, asking questions that forced Jack to articulate his thinking clearly, and approaching each new revelation with the wonder that reminded Jack why the work mattered. When his son understood that they could help provide clean electricity to schools and hospitals in places that had never had reliable power, his enthusiasm became infectious. "We could be like Santa Claus," Tommy said one evening, as they worked together on Jack's preliminary plans for the Landon Foundation. "Except instead of toys, we'd give people inventions that make their lives better." The image made Jack smile despite the weight of responsibility he was carrying. Perhaps that was exactly what Thomas had envisioned: a way to distribute beneficial technologies as freely as possible, motivated by generosity rather than profit. But the corporate pressure was intensifying. Paulson called daily with updates on new offers, and Jack had begun noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked along the road near their property. The isolation that had protected his father for 30 years might not provide the same protection now that Thomas was gone, and his patents were attracting active corporate interest. The evening before Jack planned to announce his decision about the foundation, he sat with Tommy on the cabin's front porch, watching the sun set over the Montana wilderness that had sheltered his father's work for 3 decades. The grandfather's watch ticked steadily in his pocket, marking moments that felt both precious and fleeting. "Are you scared, Dad?" Tommy asked, leaning against his father's shoulder with the trust that children showed when they believed adults could handle any challenge. Jack considered the question carefully. He was scared, terrified, actual of making the wrong choice, of failing to honor his father's sacrifice, of putting Tommy in danger, of not being equal to the responsibility he'd inherited. But he was also excited by the possibility of using their resources to genuinely help people and heal some of the wounds that his father's necessary absence had created in their family. "I'm scared," Jack admitted, "but I'm also excited. Your grandfather spent 30 years building something amazing, and now we get to decide how to use it. That's scary, but it's also the greatest gift anyone could give us." Tommy nodded gravely, his young wisdom providing comfort that Jack hadn't expected to find. "Grandpa Thomas must have been scared too when he had to leave us to protect us. But he did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do." The watch seemed to pulse with approval in Jack's pocket as he realized that his son had identified the essential truth. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to act righteously despite fear, to serve something larger than personal comfort, to honor the sacrifices of those who had come before. Tomorrow, Jack would call Paulson and reject the corporate offers. Tomorrow, he would begin implementing his father's vision of the Landon Foundation. Tomorrow, he would step fully into the role that Thomas had spent 30 years preparing him to fill. But tonight, he sat with his son on their father's porch, grateful for the love that had transcended 30 years of separation and the opportunity to finally understand the man who had sacrificed everything to ensure their future while serving the greater good. The real treasure wasn't the money or the patents, it was the chance for redemption, purpose, and the continuation of a legacy built on love rather than abandonment. The town hall deed lay spread across the Pine Ridge Community Center's main table, like a revelation that transformed everything the residents thought they knew about Thomas Landon and his 30-year presence in their community. Jack had called the meeting for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, knowing that most working families would be able to attend and that the timing would allow for thorough discussion of what he was about to propose. Nearly 200 people had gathered, a remarkable turnout for a town of less than 900 residents. Jack recognized some faces from his previous encounters. Bill Morrison and Pete Carlson sat in the front row, their expressions mixing curiosity with the skepticism they'd shown since his arrival. Sarah Mackenzie had claimed a seat near the middle, her encouraging smile providing comfort in a room full of uncertain neighbors. Tommy sat beside his father at the main table, wearing his best shirt and the serious expression he reserved for important occasions. In front of them lay documents that would fundamentally alter how Pine Ridge residents understood their community's recent history and future possibilities. "Thank you all for coming," Jack began, his voice carrying clearly through the room's careful silence. "I know there's been a lot of speculation about why my son and I came to Pine Ridge, and what we plan to do with the property my father left us. Tonight, I want to share some information that I think will surprise you as much as it surprised me." He lifted the town hall deed, letting the official document catch the overhead lighting so everyone could see its formal seals and legal stamps. "This is the deed to the Pine Ridge Community Center, along with the fire station, the library building, and approximately 40% of the commercial properties on Main Street." A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed what Jack was telling them. Sarah Mackenzie leaned forward in her seat, her expression shifting from curiosity to amazement. "According to these legal documents, my father Thomas Landon purchased these properties over the past 15 years, always through intermediary corporations and legal trusts that kept his name off the public records. He now owns nearly half of Pine Ridge's downtown commercial district." Bill Morrison stood up, his face flushed with confusion and apparent anger. "That's impossible. We would have known if someone was buying up the town. Property sales are public record." Jack nodded, understanding the man's disbelief. "You're right, that property sales are public record. But my father was very careful to structure his purchases through corporations with names like Montana Rural Development LLC and Beartooth Investment Partners. Unless you knew to look for the connection, you wouldn't realize that all these companies were controlled by the same person." He unfolded additional documents, showing the complex web of corporate structures that Thomas had created to maintain his anonymity while systematically acquiring properties throughout Pine Ridge. Each purchase had been strategic, focusing on properties that were essential to the community's function, but were struggling financially due to the area's declining population and economic challenges. "Why?" asked a woman Jack didn't recognize, her voice carrying the bewilderment that many residents were obviously feeling. Why would a hermit who barely talked to anyone spend millions of dollars buying properties in a town he seemed to want nothing to do with? Tommy had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up with the clarity that often emerged from his young perspective. Because Grandpa Thomas did care about the town. He just cared about it in a secret way, like superheroes who help people without anyone knowing who they really are. The boy's words seemed to resonate with the crowd, and Jack felt a surge of pride at his son's ability to distill complex situations into their essential emotional truth. "Tommy's right," Jack continued. "My father cared deeply about Pine Ridge, but he had reasons for keeping that care private. Over the past few weeks, I've discovered that he wasn't just living as a hermit in that cabin, he was working on technologies that could revolutionize renewable energy, improve manufacturing efficiency, and advance human prosperity on a global scale." He paused, letting the magnitude of that statement settle over the room before continuing. "The patents he developed over 30 years are worth nearly $200 million. But more than that, they represent innovations that could transform how energy is produced, stored, and distributed worldwide." Sarah Mackenzie gasped audibly, and several other residents exchanged looks of amazement that bordered on disbelief. Jack understood their reaction. He'd experienced the same overwhelming surprise when he'd first discovered the scope of his father's work. The property purchases were part of a larger plan, Jack explained, consulting his father's detailed notes about the Pine Ridge redevelopment project. He envisioned transforming this community into a model for sustainable rural development, using his technologies to create energy independence, economic opportunity, and population growth that could reverse decades of decline. Pete Carlson raised his hand tentatively. "Are you saying that Thomas, your father, was planning to help Pine Ridge? All this time, we thought he didn't care about the community at all." Jack nodded, his throat tightening with emotion as he thought about his father's commitment to people who had never understood his true intentions. He cared so much that he spent millions of dollars and decades of planning to ensure this community would have a viable future. He just never told anyone about it because the work required secrecy and because he knew that corporate interests might try to interfere if they understood what he was building. The room fell silent as residents processed this revelation. Many of them had spent 30 years viewing Thomas Landon as an eccentric outsider who contributed nothing to their community. Learning that he had actually been their secret benefactor and advocate required a fundamental reassessment of assumptions they'd held for decades. "What happens now?" Morrison asked, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching respect. "What are you planning to do with all this?" Jack looked at Tommy, drawing strength from his son's encouraging nod, then addressed the room with the decision he'd been building toward for weeks. "I'm planning to honor my father's vision," he said. "Starting next month, we'll begin implementing the Pine Ridge Sustainable Development Project. Using his technologies and the financial resources he accumulated to transform this community into a model for rural prosperity and environmental sustainability." The announcement sparked immediate discussion throughout the room, with residents talking excitedly among themselves about the implications of what Jack was proposing. For the first time since his arrival in Pine Ridge, he sensed genuine enthusiasm rather than skepticism from his neighbors. "This means jobs," Sarah Mackenzie said, her voice carrying the hope that had been absent from rural Montana communities for decades. "Real jobs using advanced technologies right here in Pine Ridge." Jack nodded, consulting his father's detailed plans for the development project. "Manufacturing jobs, research and development positions, construction work, and service industries to support a growing population." My father estimated that full implementation of his plan could bring Pine Ridge's population back to over 3,000 residents within 10 years. The transformation of the room's atmosphere was remarkable. People who had entered the meeting as skeptical neighbors were now discussing possibilities with the excitement of community members who had discovered unexpected hope for their hometown's future. Tommy tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering a question that Jack answered quietly before addressing the room again. My son wants to know if this means other kids might move to Pine Ridge so he'll have friends to play with. The laughter that greeted this question was warm and inclusive, marking a fundamental shift in how the community viewed the Landon family. They were no longer outsiders inheriting an eyesore. They were community members, bringing resources and hope that could benefit everyone. As the meeting continued past 9 o'clock, with residents asking detailed questions about timelines, job opportunities, and environmental impact, Jack realized that his father's most important achievement wasn't the financial wealth or the revolutionary patents. It was the creation of possibilities that could bring a dying community back to life while advancing technologies that could benefit humanity as a whole. The town hall deed had been more than just a legal document. It was Thomas Landon's declaration of faith in Pine Ridge's future and his commitment to ensuring that the benefits of his life's work would flow to the people who had unknowingly provided him with the peace and isolation necessary to complete his revolutionary research. The community development plans covered every surface of the renovated community center. Their detailed architectural drawings and environmental impact studies representing Thomas Landon's comprehensive vision for transforming Pine Ridge into a thriving, sustainable community. Jack had spent the morning working with Tommy to arrange the displays so that residents could walk through the plans in logical sequence, understanding how each component of the development project connected to create a unified whole. By 10 o'clock, the room was packed beyond capacity, with families spilling out onto the sidewalk and peering through windows to catch glimpses of the extraordinary blueprints that promised to revolutionize their small Montana town. Word had spread throughout the region overnight, drawing visitors from neighboring communities who wanted to see what everyone was calling the Pine Ridge Miracle. "Dad, look how excited everyone is," Tommy whispered, his young voice filled with wonder, as he watched adults and children studying the development plans with the intensity usually reserved for treasure maps. Jack nodded, his own amazement growing as he watched his neighbors' people who had been skeptical of his family just weeks earlier discussing the project details with the enthusiasm of community members who had discovered unexpected hope for their future. The centerpiece of the development plans was a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility that would produce Thomas's revolutionary solar panels and battery storage systems. According to the architectural specifications, the facility would employ over 400 people in high-paying technical positions while generating minimal environmental impact through the use of Thomas's advanced manufacturing processes. "This solar panel design is 30% more efficient than anything currently on the market," explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a renewable energy expert from Montana State University who had driven 3 hours to review the technical specifications. "If these plans are accurate, this single facility could produce enough advanced solar technology to power entire cities while creating economic opportunities that could transform this region." Sarah Mackenzie stood beside the plans for the expanded downtown district, her expression mixing amazement with something approaching disbelief. "He planned everything," she said, shaking her head slowly. "The coffee shop expansion, the new bookstore, the community garden spaces. Thomas thought through every detail of what Pine Ridge would need to support a growing population." The plans revealed that Thomas had envisioned much more than just industrial development. His blueprints included affordable housing projects designed with advanced energy efficiency, expanded educational facilities that could accommodate population growth, recreational areas that would preserve the natural beauty that made Montana attractive to families, and infrastructure improvements that would support a community of several thousand residents. Bill Morrison approached Jack, with an expression that had completely transformed from their first hostile encounter. "I owe you and your father an apology," he said, his weathered face showing genuine remorse. "We spent 30 years thinking Thomas was just a crazy hermit who didn't care about anyone but himself. Turns out, he cared about Pine Ridge more than any of us realized." "He forgave the misunderstanding long ago," Jack replied, meaning it more than he'd expected to. He knew that his work required secrecy, and he accepted that people wouldn't understand his intentions until the right time came to reveal them. Tommy had wandered over to a display showing the plans for an expanded elementary school, complete with science, laboratories, and computer facilities that would give rural students access to educational resources, typically available only in major cities. Several children from the community had gathered around him, listening as he explained his grandfather's vision with the enthusiasm that made complex ideas accessible to young minds. "The best part is that all the buildings will use Grandpa Thomas's inventions," Tommy was saying to his new friends. "So the school will make its own electricity from the sun, and it will store extra power in special batteries, so it works even when it's cloudy or snowy." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his son naturally taking on the role of community educator, sharing Thomas's vision with the next generation of Pine Ridge residents who would grow up benefiting from his grandfather's 30-year commitment to their future. Pete Carlson had been studying the employment projections and economic impact studies, and now he approached Jack with questions that revealed both understanding and practical concern. "This is incredible, but it's also enormous. How do we know we can actually make this work? Pine Ridge has never had anything approaching this scale of development." It was a fair question, and one that Jack had been preparing to address since deciding to move forward with his father's plans. "My father spent decades not just designing the technologies, but also researching the implementation challenges. He studied successful rural development projects worldwide, consulted with experts in sustainable manufacturing, and created detailed timelines that account for everything from workforce training to environmental protection." Jack led Pete to a section of the display that showed Thomas's phased implementation strategy. Rather than attempting to build everything simultaneously, the development would proceed in carefully planned stages over a 5-year period, allowing the community to adapt to growth while ensuring that each phase was successfully completed before moving to the next. Phase 1 begins with the manufacturing facility and worker training programs, Jack explained. Phase 2 adds the housing developments and infrastructure improvements. Phase 3 brings the expanded commercial district and educational facilities. Each stage is designed to support the next, while generating the economic activity necessary to sustain long-term growth. The room buzzed with conversations as residents discussed how the development plans would affect their own lives and families. Younger adults who had been considering leaving Pine Ridge to find career opportunities were now talking about staying to participate in the technological revolution their community was about to experience. Older residents who had watched their town slowly decline for decades were expressing cautious optimism about its potential for renewal. "Jack," Sarah Mackenzie called from across the room, "you need to see this response." She was holding a tablet computer, showing him messages that had been flooding social media since news of the Pine Ridge Development Project had begun spreading online. Renewable energy companies, environmental organizations, and rural development advocates were expressing intense interest in Thomas's innovations and their potential for replication in other struggling communities. "We're getting inquiries from towns across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas," Sarah explained. "Everyone wants to know if your father's technologies could work in their communities too." Jack realized that Pine Ridge was about to become more than just a beneficiary of Thomas's vision. It was positioned to serve as a demonstration project that could inspire similar developments throughout rural America. The implications were staggering, both in terms of economic opportunity and environmental impact. As the afternoon progressed and the crowd began to thin, Jack found himself standing with Tommy in front of the display, showing Thomas's original cabin property. The architectural plans revealed that his father had always intended for the cabin to become the headquarters of the Landon Foundation, with underground facilities expanded to include research laboratories, meeting spaces, and archives that would preserve his innovations for future generations. "Dad," Tommy said softly, his young voice carrying wisdom that continued to amaze Jack, "I think Grandpa Thomas is proud of us. I think he knew we would choose to help people instead of just keeping all the money for ourselves." Jack nodded, his eyes misting as he contemplated the transformation that had occurred in their lives and their community over the past month. They had arrived in Pine Ridge as desperate strangers, inheriting what appeared to be worthless property. They were now positioned to lead a development project that could revolutionize rural sustainability while honoring the memory of a man whose love had never wavered despite 30 years of necessary separation. The community development plans spread around them represented more than just architectural blueprints. They were the physical manifestation of Thomas Landon's faith in human potential and his commitment to ensuring that technological advancement served community flourishing rather than corporate profits. The real treasure hadn't been the money, or even the patent it had been the opportunity for redemption, purpose, and the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent just weeks earlier. The new family portrait sat on the mantelpiece of the fully restored cabin, its frame catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows that had been replaced and gleamed like promises of transparency and hope. 6 months had passed since Jack and Tommy had first arrived in Pine Ridge, and the transformation both of their lives and their community felt like something from the adventure stories that Tommy loved to read. In the photograph, father and son stood together on the cabin's rebuilt front porch, their arms around each other's shoulders and their faces showing the peace that came from understanding their place in something larger than themselves. Behind them, the cabin displayed the careful restoration that had revealed its true character, no longer a monument to neglect, but a testament to what patient love could accomplish over time. Tommy had grown taller during their months in Montana, but more importantly, he had grown into his role as the inheritor of his grandfather's legacy. At 9 years old, he could explain renewable energy principles to visiting dignitaries with the same enthusiasm he brought to describing his favorite superhero stories. The Landon Foundation had become his second classroom, where he learned that intelligence combined with compassion could create possibilities that seemed impossible. "Dad, look," Tommy called from the kitchen window, where he was watching the construction crews working on the first phase of the Pine Ridge Sustainable Development Project. "They're installing the solar panels on the community center today." Jack joined his son at the window, marveling at how different the view had become in just 6 months. Where once there had been only wilderness and isolation, now there was purposeful activity as contractors, engineers, and local workers collaborated to implement Thomas's vision for community transformation. The manufacturing facility was already operational, employing 230 people from Pine Ridge and surrounding communities in the production of advanced solar panels and battery storage systems that were generating international interest. Orders were arriving from cities across North America and Europe, providing economic stability that the region hadn't experienced in decades. But the true measure of success wasn't found in employment statistics or production. It was visible in the faces of neighbors who had rediscovered hope for their community's future. Children who had been planning to leave Pine Ridge after high school were now talking about college degrees that would prepare them for careers in renewable energy and sustainable technology. Families who had been struggling with economic uncertainty were making long-term plans that included staying in the community where their roots ran deep. "The reporter from the Washington Post is coming today to interview us about the foundation," Jack reminded Tommy, as they prepared for another day of managing their increasingly complex responsibilities. Tommy nodded seriously, straightening his shirt with the gravity he reserved for important occasions. Over the past months, he had become surprisingly comfortable with media attention, treating journalists' questions as opportunities to educate people about his grandfather's innovations and their potential for improving lives worldwide. The Landon Foundation had evolved far beyond what even Thomas had envisioned in his most optimistic planning. Rather than simply releasing patents for free use, the Foundation had developed a comprehensive system for transferring beneficial technologies to communities and organizations that could implement them for maximum social benefit. Solar panel manufacturing cooperatives had been established in 12 developing countries, using Thomas's designs to provide affordable renewable energy in regions that had never had reliable electricity. Battery storage systems were being deployed to stabilize electrical grids in island nations that had previously depended entirely on imported fossil fuels. Manufacturing process improvements were being shared with worker-owned enterprises that prioritized environmental sustainability and fair labor practices. The financial management of the foundation required constant attention, but Jack had discovered that he possessed an intuitive understanding of his father's investment strategies. The patent royalties and investment returns continued to grow, providing the resources necessary to expand the foundation's work while maintaining the long-term sustainability that Thomas had built into his planning. Jack, the call from the United Nations is scheduled for 2 o'clock. Sarah Mackenzie reminded him as she entered the cabin with the morning's correspondence. She had become the Foundation's unofficial coordinator, managing communications and logistics with the efficiency that had made her general store successful for decades. The UN call was regarding a proposal to implement Thomas's technologies as part of their sustainable development initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. The potential impact was staggering. Millions of people could gain access to clean electricity, improved manufacturing capabilities, and the economic opportunities that came with technological advancement. Tommy had been following the international discussions with the fascination that other children reserved for video games, understanding intuitively that his grandfather's inventions could help solve problems on a scale that transformed entire nations, rather than just individual communities. "Dad," Tommy said as they walked together toward the Foundation's expanded headquarters, "do you think Grandpa Thomas knew that his inventions would help so many people?" Jack considered the question carefully, thinking about his father's journals and the careful planning that had characterized every aspect of his work. "I think he hoped they would, buddy. But I also think he would be amazed by how much you've helped make that happen." The headquarters building had been constructed according to Thomas's original blueprints, but expanded to accommodate the Foundation's growing staff and the increasing number of visitors who came to Pine Ridge to study the successful implementation of sustainable development principles. The architecture combined advanced environmental technology with the rustic aesthetic that honored the community's rural character. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs documenting the Foundation's projects, worldwide solar installations in Kenyan villages, battery manufacturing cooperatives in Guatemala, improved agricultural processing facilities in rural India. Each image represented lives that had been improved through the application of technologies that Thomas had developed in his isolated Montana workshop. But the most meaningful photograph was smaller and less dramatic than the others. It showed Jack and Tommy working together in Thomas's original workshop, studying patent documents and prototype devices with the concentration that marked their shared commitment to understanding and continuing his work. The image captured something that Jack had never expected to experience: the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent, the discovery of purpose that extended beyond personal survival, and the deepening of a father-son relationship that had been strengthened rather than strained by extraordinary circumstances. As the afternoon progressed and the UN call confirmed plans for implementing Thomas's technologies across multiple African nations, Jack found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a desperate single father, inheriting what appeared to be worthless property from a man he had resented for 30 years. Now, he was the director of a foundation that was revolutionizing how beneficial technologies were developed and distributed worldwide, working alongside a son who had inherited not just financial security, but a sense of purpose that would guide him throughout his life. That evening, as Pine Ridge settled into the quiet rhythms of a small town that was no longer struggling but thriving, Jack and Tommy sat together on their restored front porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in colors that seemed to celebrate the day's accomplishments. "Do you miss our old life in Detroit?" Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had become his trademark. "I miss Mom sometimes," he said quietly. "But I think she would be proud of what we're doing here, and I think she would have liked knowing about Grandpa Thomas's real story." Jack nodded, his throat tightening with emotion as he thought about Sarah's memory and how she would have responded to the revelations about Thomas's work and sacrifice. She had always encouraged Jack to forgive his father's abandonment, understanding somehow that the full story might be more complex than it appeared. The grandfather's watch ticked steadily in Jack's pocket, marking moments that no longer felt urgent, but instead felt precious time spent in service of something larger than personal comfort. Guided by the example of a man who had sacrificed everything to ensure that beneficial technologies would serve human flourishing rather than corporate profits. "Tommy," Jack said softly, "I want to write a letter to your grandfather. Would you help me with it?" Tommy's face lit up with the enthusiasm that marked his favorite projects. Together, they went inside to compose a letter that would never be mailed, but needed to be written, a message of gratitude, understanding, and commitment to continuing the work that Thomas had begun in isolation, but that they would continue in community. "Dear Dad," Jack began, and for the first time in 30 years, the word carried love rather than resentment. "Thank you for the courage to sacrifice your own happiness for our future, for the wisdom to build something larger than any of us could imagine, and for the faith that we would eventually understand what you were trying to accomplish." The letter continued for several pages, acknowledging the pain of separation while celebrating the extraordinary legacy that Thomas had created through his patience, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to serving something greater than himself. As they finished writing, the restored cabin around them felt less like a place of exile and more like a sanctuary where love had been preserved across decades of misunderstanding, where innovation had been nurtured in service of human flourishing, and where a family had been healed through the discovery of purpose that extended far beyond their individual lives. The new family portrait on the mantelpiece captured more than just their physical appearance. It documented the transformation of two people who had discovered that the greatest treasure wasn't wealth or even technological innovation, but the opportunity to continue the work of healing a world that desperately needed the kind of patient, intelligent love that Thomas Landon had spent 30 years building into the foundation of tomorrow.